without further ado, just to introduce Margaret. Margaret is an internationally noted writer, artist, and curator who focuses on the relations of science and the wider cultural landscape. She's got an Institute for Figuring sort of company with her twin sister, Christine, and they've been doing the Crochet Coral Reef project for a number of years in different communities and different settings, and having it exhibited around the world, including at the current Venice Biennale. Margaret is a widely published author. She has 3 or 4 books under her belt, including Fringe Physics, The Pearly Gates of Cyberspace, Pythagoras' Trousers, and other great books that many of you would already know about. She is a science communicator. She has a mathematics degree and a sensibility for the arts and community and access. So without further ado, thank you, Margaret.
What I want to talk about today is the concept of mathematics as a form of material play. And sorry, can we go to the first slide, John D?
Yep, mathematics as material play.
Yeah. I'm going to talk about the idea that mathematics isn't just a symbolic thing, but is also something that we can know through processes of material making and doing. And rhetorically, I want to ask the question, does a sea slug know hyperbolic geometry? And I hope to convince you by the end of this that the answer to that is plausible. So I want to begin with the question, what does it mean to know mathematics at all? Can you, Andy?
There's just a little bit of dropout, so I don't know, maybe just repeat the last thing of the question. Can a slug know mathematics?
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I hope to convince you by the end of this talk that the answer to the question is plausibly yes. So can we go to the next slide?
Yep.
The question I want to begin with is the broad question, what does it mean to know mathematics? Now, most people think that knowing mathematics means being able to read equations out of textbooks. And that's how I learned it at university, through studying equations in textbooks. But what I want to talk about today is that mathematics can be known through material, physical actions and doing processes. And I want to use a specific case, which is the case of hyperbolic geometry, which brings up a lot of interesting questions. Can we go to the next slide, John D?
It's up.
So basically, hyperbolic geometry is a particularly wonderful case to explore this, because hyperbolic geometry is a subject that mathematicians themselves, human mathematicians, spend hundreds of years trying to prove impossible, because of reasons we'll get to in a minute. But although human mathematicians long thought that this was absolutely impossible and outside plausible logic, let's go to the next slide.
Okay.
We have here 2 heads of letters, which are actually, in the structure of their leaves, actually making hyperbolic geometric surfaces. So the curly, frilly vegetables that we know of, like lettuces and kales, actually realize hyperbolic structures in the very nature of their being. They make them. And I want to claim here that actually making hyperbolic geometry surfaces constitutes a form of knowing about them. These kinds of frilly, curly, hyperbolic things occur all throughout nature, and lots of them around us all the time. In cactuses, they're a very famous example. But the biggest domain of hyperbolic geometric realizations in the physical world is in the sea, in coral reefs. Sorry, John, could we go to the next slide?
Yes, cactus is up at the moment.
Cactus, yeah. So, and then can we go on to the next slide?
Okay, coral reef.
Coral reefs. So the biggest domain of hyperbolic surfaces is in the sea, particularly on reefs, where lots of reef organisms, like corals and kelps and sponges and nudibranchs, make hyperbolic geometric surfaces. Next slide.
Okay.
So you see before you now a whole series of pictures of corals, all which are making hyperbolic geometry. And it turns out that in the oceans, there is, as it were, a natural taxonomy of hyperbolic structures. And they occur also not just in brainless corals. We should stress here that corals are organisms without a brain at all. So without a brain at all, they can't possibly, in some sense, in the canonical sense, be, as it were, comprehending symbolic geometry like humans do. But I want to claim that comprehension of mathematics goes beyond that. Can we go to the next slide, John D?
Yes.
Another kind of organism that makes hyperbolic structures is sea slugs, called nudibranchs. Corals and organisms like sea corals and sponges use them as a form of filter feeding. These hyperbolic surfaces are a maximal way to get the maximum surface area in a given volume, so it's very good filtering nutrients from the sea. And hyperbolic sea slugs do it as a method of having maximum surface area, gives them a maximum way to propel themselves through the ocean. So I want to claim that these brainless organisms actually do understand in some sense, or a better word I believe to use is know hyperbolic geometry. Can we move on to the next slide, John D? There should be a quote from a famous mathematician.
Yes.
Now, as I said earlier, human mathematicians with the biggest brains and the greatest knowledge of mathematics in the formalized sense spent hundreds of years, in fact, almost 2,000 years, believing that hyperbolic geometry was not only impossible, but illogical because it violated one of the axioms of Euclid's geometry. And this quote that you see before you now is written by one of the mathematicians studying this hyperbolic geometry in the early 19th, late 18th century. And he's basically another mathematician it up because it will drive you mad. Now, human mathematicians are generally thought to be the arbiters of what mathematical knowledge is knowing. But what is interesting here is the greatest mathematicians of human culture could not comprehend what sea slugs and corals had been doing for hundreds of millions of years. Next slide. Now, it turns out that this hyperbolic geometry is an alternative to two other forms of geometry, which each person in the audience knows very well. There are three kinds of geometry. One is spherical geometry, which is the surface of the Earth. One is flat Euclidean geometry that we all learn about in school. And the other one is this hyperbolic geometry. And I'm not going to go through too much what it means because we have a short time here. But I just want to give you a flavor of it. Basically, these three geometries can be conceived of as the geometric equivalent of zero, the positive numbers, and the negative numbers. Sorry, Johnny, are you on the next slide?
I am now with the Euclidean space zero. Yeah.
Yeah. So just to give you some flavor of this, if you can imagine, we have three types of numbers: zero, positive numbers, and negative numbers. So it turns out there are geometric equivalents of this. So a flat surface is a zero curvature space. A sphere is clearly a curved space, and mathematicians characterize it as a positive curvature space. And so it makes sense in a way that if there's a positive curvature space and a zero curvature space, you could have something that's a negative curvature space. And it turns out that that's what hyperbolic geometry is. But that's just one way of characterizing. There are lots of other ways of characterizing it. Mathematicians have all sorts of ways of doing this. But what I want to point out is how we write it down symbolically. However we describe it to ourselves in equations, it is also first and foremost in the natural world realized materially. Now, corals and kelps and cactuses and lettuce leaves do it biologically. But it turns out that humans to make models of this, the best way that we can do it is with crochet or other iterative handicrafts like knitting and tatting. But crochet is the easiest one. And could we move on to the next slide, John D?
Yeah, hyperbolic crochet.
Yeah. And it turns out that although mathematicians, who are all men, had discovered hyperbolic geometry around the turn of the 19th century, it took until 1993, next slide please, for a female mathematician named Dr. Diana Taimina at Cornell University to realize how you could make a model of it. And she realized that you could make models of this using crochet. And she and her husband, Dr. David Henderson, used crochet models to teach non-Euclidean geometry to math majors at Cornell, and other mathematicians are now beginning to use these models too. Now, the interesting thing about this is that when I went to university, we had to study this symbolically, and studying hyperbolic geometry symbolically requires you to accept a lot of things on, as it were, faith, looking at the equations and saying, I don't really quite understand how that works in reality, but I'm just going to have to accept the symbols. So Dr. Taimina came along and said, you know what, I can do this with crochet. And you can hold these models in your hand. Next slide.
Got it?
And you can stitch theorems onto them about the way that things like parallel lines behave differently on a hyperbolic surface to on a flat Euclidean surface. Things like triangles behave differently. So we're all told, for instance, that on the surface of that triangles always add up to 180 degrees. And while that is always true on a flat plate, it's not true on a hyperbolic surface. So it turns out that on a hyperbolic surface, all sorts of things like lines and triangles and circles have different properties. So the very conception of what is a circle or what is a triangle is allied with the underlying geometry. And if you have a different underlying geometry, you have different underlying geometrical relations. And what's marvelous about Dr. Taimina's models is that you can literally stick these theorems with cotton and thread onto these hyperbolic models to demonstrate the tactile truth. Next slide, please.
Okay, tactile truth.
You can physically demonstrate the tactile truth of symbolic rules that are actually very hard to accept when you only look through the equations. Now, this issue of discovering that there were different kinds of geometries turned out to be incredibly important historically, because as soon as mathematicians in the early 19th century realized that there were different geometric structures that were possible in pure mathematics, it raised the question, which they immediately realized, is what is the structure of the physical universe? The physical universe that we live in has dimensions of space, and the question is, what is the structure of the space we live in? Up until this time, it had been assumed that the structure of space must be Euclidean. Newton believed that, Galileo believed that, Kant tried to prove that it was absolutely an a priori essential truth. But once mathematicians realized there were different geometries possible, it raised the question, well, does the physical universe have options too? And indeed, one of the most important questions that astronomers are currently trying to answer is, what is the structure of the physical universe on the largest scale? And there is some intriguing evidence that it might be hyperbolic, although most of the evidence suggests that it is Euclidean on the largest possible scale. Now, this is the mathematics that underlies general relativity. So one of the things I like about the story is that there is a direct line here from sea slugs and brainless corals to the architecture of the cosmos and what, the supposedly, deepest minds of physics are thinking about. Now, we human cosmologists and astronomers, sorry, John, if you moved on to the cosmology, the star picture?
I got a star picture up, yeah.
Sorry, yes, I should have said. So one of the things that is interesting about this is that we humans, with our mighty computers and our mighty equations of general relativity, are trying to figure out the structure of four-dimensional space-time. But if we move, next slide, please.
Okay.
If we consider the humble calla lily, that is making a hyperbolic structure. And it turns out that there is physicists who are studying the structure of flowers like calla lilies. And in order to model this hyperbolic structure that the calla lily is making, they actually have to make the models in 4 dimensions. They have to model them mathematically with 4 dimensions. And so a question I want to raise is, does a calla lily in some sense understand four-dimensional mathematics? Now, I know that is controversial. Can we move on to the next slide, John Dee?
Yes.
I know this is a controversial proposition, but if in some sense we humans have to model the structure of the calla lily in 4D, it suggests to me that in some sense the calla lily itself is doing something in 4D. So again, we are confronted with the question, what does it mean to know a mathematical form or mathematical structure? Now, I come to think that the way that is useful to think about mathematics is to make an analogy with music, because music is also something that has this dichotomy of a symbolic and a physical dimension. Most people who play music do not read it and write it and have not throughout history. But music can be written down. It can be have this beautiful symbolic. Sorry, move on. Next slide.
Okay.
Have you got music in front of you?
Yes.
So, we all know what written music looks like, and it's a highly powerful symbolic form. And people who are well versed in music can read it and write, and even when they read it, it plays in their heads because their brains are attuned. But most of us do not read and write music, and most musicians throughout history have not read and written music, yet they play it brilliantly. And in the end, music is a performative activity, not primarily for most people a symbolic activity. And I would like to say that I believe mathematics can be considered as an analogy to this. Mathematics can be written, and we need people who are symbolically adept at writing mathematics down. But for most of us, we can encounter mathematics as a performative activity. And we can, next slide, please, I'll do the pink one.
Okay.
What I want to say is that just as most people play music without necessarily reading it or writing it, many people, all people I believe, play mathematics to a relatively high level. You're not going to be able to necessarily pass a university math exam, but there are a lot of domains of mathematics, including this non-Euclidean geometry, that can be learned and practiced and played with and understood and known through material practices. And one practice is you can make the beautiful hyperbolic structures with paper cuts by literally cutting and sticky taping paper together. Next slide, please.
Yes.
But the most powerful way to do it is to learn to crochet. And through crochet, you can actually enter into a realm of non-Euclidean exploration. Next slide.
Yes.
If you want to do them purely mathematically, you carry out a simple formula, which any handicraft person will be able to follow easy, which is just simply crochet in stitches, then increase one. So crochet 3 stitches, increase one, you keep going, crochet 4 stitches, increase one, and keep going. As long as you do a similar rate of increase, you make a mathematically correct hyperbolic structure. But slow.
Okay.
But is never mathematically perfect. Next slide.
Okay.
In nature forms mathematics all the time, but never does it mathematically perfectly. So, for instance, everyone knows what a sphere is, but there is no such thing in nature as a perfect sphere. There are lots of things that a sphere like eggs, which are bigger at one end and smaller at the other end, or sea urchins that are like a flattened sphere. So nature never does a perfect sphere, and nature is a perfect hyperbolic. All nature structures are aberrant and wonky. They are still, next slide please. All nature structures are aberrant but they are still geometrically describable. If you wanted to, you could actually, map the surface of any, random form of nature with what's called Riemannian geometry, which is an extension of hyperbolic geometry. And it turns out that in the sea, coral reefs, all the different species of corals and nudibranchs, etc., they are all typically distinct. You know, they have their own aberrantly. Some of them a bit flatter on one end, a bit more curly here, a bit more frilly over there. And the project that I do, which is this Crochet Coral Reef project, is about bringing together mathematics and making with the view to bringing mathematics to people, giving people a way to access mathematics. I mean, the project, many other things, but it is a way of giving the people who engage in the project a way of exploring structure and learning about non-Euclidean geometry for themselves. Next slide, please, John.
Okay.
The project rests at the intersection of art and science because we are grounding it in mathematics. We are looking at the structures of emulating structures of living corals, but also wanting people through the making of these structures to actually understand non-Euclideanness for themselves. And next slide, please, John.
Yes.
Next slide.
So the one that has your name and Christine, or the next one?
Yeah, could we go to the next one? Sorry.
Okay, evolution.
So what we have discovered this project is that as you crochet and you don't stick to the exact mathematical formula and you start deviating, what you actually begin to yourself is a whole space of mathematical possibility wherein if you, for instance, say crochet, increase every 2 for a while, then increase every 3, then increase every 10, what you are doing is you're actually exploring how non-Euclidean mathematics has, as it were, a Darwinian complexity. There is an ever infinite array of different surfaces that become possible. Next slide, please.
Okay.
So just as music has sort of endless variations on a theme, the enigma variations of fame, so does mathematical structures. Next slide, please.
Okay.
So next slide.
Okay.
So there is, as it were, this ever evolving, ever possible landscape of mathematical forms. And that through this simple technique of making crochet forms, ordinary people can actually explore a realm of applied mathematics. And in fact, we want to claim that our Crochet Coral Reef project is actually a global open source experiment in applied mathematics. Now, life, next slide, please, Laura.
Okay.
Next slide, John. Life also is a realm of mathematical play. That nature, as we've seen in these coral structures and cactuses and lettuce leaves, nature is engaged in mathematical play. Now, nature doesn't write equations down, but it does mathematics. It performs mathematics. It has these highly complicated mathematical structures that the supposedly simple brainless organisms realize. And what I want to do, I'm just going to end my talk here, is to say that I think this is a metaphor for how we humans can think. Because just as corals, which do not have brains and do not even have, they have a very, very simple nervous system, but they don't have a brain, are performing mathematics, we humans can perform mathematics through such processes as crochet and sticking and gluing bits of paper together. And this becomes a very powerful methodology for opening doors to the higher realms of mathematics that most common people are not given credit for being able to comprehend. Most of the people who've done our Crochet Coral Reef project are women. Many of them are women who do not have formal, educations beyond high school. But in our crochet workshops, we end up having discussions about the structure of space-time and how we actually would go about telling, do we live in a hyperbolic or a Euclidean universe? And I think that one of the things that's really important about this project is it suggests that ordinary people can actually understand supposedly higher order symbolic structures if they are given ways and means into it that enable them to learn through their hands. So I'll just end there, John.
Thank you so much.